welcome to the Decolonizing the UW curriculum panel event. Today we're being recorded, so say hi to the camera. Yeah, I have about 4 panelists with me today, and others will be joining soon. The first panelist that will be joining us today is Emmanuel. Actually, I forgot to introduce myself. So everyone, welcome again. My name is Jane Ojiako, and I am the Vice President Education here at the Student Union UE. And with me today, we'll be talking about decolonizing the curriculum, what it means. So if you've never heard it before, it's a good time. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be happy to dive in and let you know what you need to know about decolonizing the curriculum. One of my panelists today is Dr. Emmanuel Ajuku. He's a current interim deputy head of department in applied sciences here at UE. And with me also is Anne de Graaf Johnson. She's a senior lecturer in planning and architecture at the university here at UE. Also joining us today is Xavier, and he's a UE alumni. He works as an assistant support lecturer in University of Law here at UE. And finally is Sahala. Sahala is an alumni of UE, and she's a recent graduate, but now works for BBC as a project manager. Thank you all. And now to go straight into the panel discussion. Hi, Anne. Thanks for joining us. I guess my first question will go out to Anne. I'm sure most of us are curious to know what decolonizing the curriculum means. So a brief breakdown on what the terminology actually means would be good to start off.
Well, I think in terms of how we view it, if you're talking about colonization or colonial, I can't say it even, ism, is that it tends to assume that there is a perfect right for one country to take over control of another country and its people and exploit it. But what that tends to entail as well is that there's an influence or an assumed assumption of superiority, which means that creating a hierarchy which might include hierarchy of perceived intelligence, leadership, roles, etc. And you know, very much education that I was brought up in this country was that empire was good. It was an indicator of a great in the Great Britain, and that Great Britain extends its values to other parts of the world, and so there's a assumed superiority in terms of values.
I guess shedding more light into what it means specifically for higher education would be good, as we're in a higher education setting, just to give our students a brief, introduction to what it actually means in terms of in the higher education setting.
I think we have to think that most people who are academics in certainly UK born and bred academics will have been brought up in an education system that endorsed empire if they're of a certain age, or they were parents of academics who were brought up, were the parents who were brought up in that sphere. I think a lot of academics don't have that much access to diverse communities in their upbringing, and that may also create a kind of academic silo that brings colonialism into the picture.
Thank you so much for those words of wisdom. Xavier, from a student perspective, is there anything you would like to add to what she's defined? As I see a lot of nerding.
Yeah, I think Anne summarized colonization, decolonization really well there. For me, I kind of new discussion would come up and wrote down some words that colonization made me think about, and things like domination, exploitation, kind of stifling, kind of existence stifling economies, suppression. It's about superiority and influence and power. I think those are the key words there. But in terms of decolonization and in a higher education context, I think I've observed, like during my kind of transition from being a final year student and being involved in equity and being like a co-chair of the student committee, and then transitioning into academia as a member of staff. In that kind of the last 18 months to 2 years, I've seen decolonisation become a buzzword. And before that, I saw that happen with the word diversity. And before that, I'm sure there's Anne will be able and Emmanuel will be able to kind of provide suggestions for other words that's happened to before. And I think it becomes, when words get latched onto like that, it becomes the meaning gets lost completely, and you end up with often BAME academics being frustrated that words aren't having the meaning they're intended to have, and instead they become part of a kind of a trend or a marketing campaign for the universities. And yeah, I'll stop there. I think that's dangerous. Basically, I think it's dangerous that things get warped and people use big words that have power and meaning and could be doing something that's really special and great in terms of enhancing opportunities for people, for students, all students, not just BAME students. Instead, I think it becomes about marketing. It becomes about making your reputation, making yourself look good, rather than implementing things that will actually make change and difference.
Thank you so much for that, Xavier. I think that just to get more of a breakdown of what we're actually talking about, I think this will lead to my next question of what does decolonizing the curriculum actually mean? Maybe I should throw it to Mr. Emmanuel. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, so you're asking what it actually means.
Yeah.
It's a very broad term in terms of decolonizing the curriculum. I think just listening to the conversation from Anne and Xavier, I think it's important to think about, we need to decolonize even way beyond the curriculum. It's not so much just around an educational thing. I know there are conversations about decolonizing museums. So a couple of Sundays ago, I was on BBC Bristol Radio talking about a lot of the artifacts that were taken away from Africa and why those things sitting in a museum where people have no understanding or concept of them are sitting somewhere and people admire and take pictures, when they actually have meanings in different environments, and they actually reflect histories and thousands of years of actually in industry, language, culture, everything. So it's the defacing of language, it's a defacing of history, it's a defacing of culture. So I think it is something that, if we look at it from a university point of view, we're talking about actually spaces, the university space itself, the histories, which have actually defined what has become of the curriculum, the resources as well that are actually moving across within education. So, and all of these things actually have a role to play within the curriculum itself, because how you define what is the prevailing culture, the prevailing knowledge system. I was watching some videos yesterday, and I think if you throw this question at many students and probably a lot of academics, we're using numbers in mathematics, but actually, where did those numbers actually originate from? So we're looking at Arabic. That's where we should be looking at Persia. So where is knowledge created from? So I think the part of the reason why there needs to be a decolonizing of the curriculum is that everyone needs to get a full picture of actually what they're learning. We need to also sort of unpack a lot of the stuff people have actually been taught, because the words which Xavier used earlier in terms of dominance, control, all of these words are the things which are still being pushed through the existing curriculum. So the existing curriculum actually promotes white supremacy. Whether people like the word or not, whether people are comfortable with the word of white supremacy or not, the existing curriculum continues to actually exacerbate and promote white supremacy. So what we need to do is, if we claim that we do not ascribe to white supremacy, or we think it's a bad thing, then that is actually the impetus that we need to begin to sort of dismantle what is an existing system. Doesn't mean we need to say, right, we can't teach, or we shouldn't have in the curriculum what we've been learning for all this period, but what we need to do is interrogate what is in that learning and be honest about it. So I think part of we're not just at the place where there's enough intellectual curiosity and honesty about the curriculum. That's part of the reason why this is a slow conversation. That needs to happen. And then we can start to think about, what is that curriculum supposed to look like? Should we be using the existing model to get everybody across the world to buy into a certain knowledge about science, a certain knowledge of architecture? Anne is from architecture. Who says the models that we're using in the global north represent what actually should be in the global south? So these are sort of the conversations that need to be had in terms of that whole decolonizing curriculum. But it's really about reimagining learning, reimagining education, reimagining the cultures that actually build and drive the education, the systems, knowledge, what is knowledge, who owns knowledge. All of those things are parts of this conversation.
Can I also just add, following on from Emmanuel's points there, I think I agree with everything he said, and I think one of the reasons why progress has been so slow and will continue to be so slow, unfortunately I'm quite pessimistic, but I think is because for there to be real decolonisation, it requires the powers that be, whether that's the government, whether that's execs in academia, whether that's senior lecturers, it's going to require them to relinquish control, and that is not a popular. That's not a popular ideology. People don't like giving up things that they don't, and even though it will benefit the wider community. And I think that's why I think Emmanuel's totally right when he talks about the fact that we need to reimagine things. There's a famous quote, I think it's from Andre Lord, about the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. We need, yeah.
I think also, I mean, I think you have to be clear that it's not just within the teacher delivery and curriculum that the issue occurs. You know, if you look at the sort of areas that are, say, student facing, the mindset goes across the university in terms of, and that across higher education. And I think to some extent, you know, I sort of share Xavier's optimism, because this isn't a new topic. This has been going on for decades. It probably was going on in the 19th century when, you know, well-educated, for instance, Africans were saying, you know, this needs to stop. This is our legacy. This is our history. Similarly in India, etc. So I think, you know, I think higher education needs to recognise just how backward it is in terms of this, and how problematic it is in terms of engagement with the reality of a global context. And I think this is also about working with, so it's not always about completely handing over control, but it's about changing the nature of control and leadership. And I think actually it would make life a lot more interesting and enjoyable, frankly.
Thank you for that. I think most of our audience would be curious, what does it mean between diversifying and decolonizing? Because Emmanuel, you spoke a lot about adding, like for instance, in maths, where does the figures come from? Does that mean that when we add these things, we are decolonized? What does that mean in terms of decolonizing and diversifying? Maybe I should go on to Sahala this time, then we'll come back.
Yeah, so I don't think there's a difference between decolonizing the curriculum and diversifying. I feel like you can't have one without the other. And I feel like with decolonizing the curriculum, it's more about the actual, the things that you're being taught, whereas diversifying is who you're being taught by. But in addition, it's about the reading list and about everything that goes in. So that together they go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. And decolonizing the curricula is an active promotion of all the inclusive curriculum and supporting the needs of all learners, especially through the different cultural lenses, because we are increasing globalized world. We're all just interconnected, whether you're like in the UK, Australia, whether you're in Somalia, we're all just connected as a global bubble. And it's really important to have those different perspectives being taught. So we all we just understand more about the world around us and just being more culturally competent and just learning about different things. Because there's, like, for example, with what I studied, psychology, it's really important to learn about different elements of that and different elements around like the entire world as well.
Thank you for bringing your student perspective in. Mr. Emmanuel, was that, can you shed more light in terms of from an academic's perspective, in terms of what diversifying and decolonizing means?
I think there's a slight difference. Well, I guess I'll say there's a difference. There's a big difference here, because we can diversify by placing things in the space, but there's still a structure which is still there, which we haven't changed. So we could, I think when this, I think Xavier, you were, when you talked about being skeptical about the system earlier, this is actually where the conversation comes in, because institutions can say, oh, we're now diverse because you can now see to your right or see to your left, there's now something that looks different here. The fact that there's something that is there doesn't necessarily mean it's change or there's a transformative action that is going on. So I think it's when we talk about reimagining, because I saw Simon ask the question there about reimagining, it's reimagining from a point of view of where are the power structures? How are those power structures marginalizing, reducing? Because when we think about the whole point of colonization, it's to just define it. One of the definitions is actually the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another, occupying and then exploiting. So if we diversify, have we let go of any of these things? We haven't. The same power structure is deciding what should be and then when it should be. So I think it's really about, it's also looking at those power structures and saying, okay, actually, if we're going to decolonize, then there needs to be sort of a balance of power in that conversation as well. That's one side of it. That's one of the reasons why it's very difficult to achieve this conversation, because you're now expecting that there will be parity and equality, genuine equality. And that's why it's also different. In terms of, for diversity, I think for me, diversity is always like the first basic step. Diversity is just like A, and we still got Z to get to, because we've now figured out that there's diversity and it's different from inclusivity. Diversity is different from equality. Diversity is different from equity. But diversity is also different from decolonization. So there are all these differences and all these nuances around the conversation that we need to be able to understand. And it might seem complex to a lot of people that it's a very complex thing to talk about decolonizing. It isn't really that complex, because actually what we are trying to do in an educational setting is to inform, is to transform, is to enlighten. How enlightened are we when we have only one narrative? We can't truly be enlightened if we just have one narrative, which keeps everyone believing that this is the way the world is created. We once believed at one point that the world was flat. But at some point, we then came to agree that the world wasn't flat. Except somebody else comes in to prove that the world is flat. I think everyone believes right now the world isn't flat. So in the same vein, we need to think about our histories of learning and the cultures around the learning that we've actually taken on and utilized for a very long period. But I think in terms of comparing it to diversity, yes, you can see where there might be some similarities in terms of, okay, we're now starting to see different texts, different authors, the differences are there, but actually that doesn't change what knowledge is there.
Yeah.
Can I just chip in and want to just respond to Simon Cox's comment, but also chip in on this, that Simon Cox has asked about it, is that about reimagining education from primary school onwards? I'd say it's about reimagining education from cradle to grave, frankly. That you know, at the moment there's a deficit of inclusive curriculum in schools, and again, diversity, and Bristol is particularly lacking in Black teachers. I think there's only about 26 or so. 26 or 27. So there's an issue about who's teaching children, but also what is in their education map that reflects the realities. And I think it's again about teaching history warts and all, teaching education warts and all, rather than education as propaganda in terms of historical propaganda. The narrative isn't in fact accurate. But it's meant to applaud a certain group of people, and that's highly problematic. In relation to the difference between colonialisation and diversification, I don't really use the word diversifying, so it's not particularly in my sphere. And although when people have talked about diversity, which I do talk quite a lot about, but I am aware that, for instance, a conference some years ago, which the call out was about diversity. I think only 3 out of 60 accepted refereed pieces referred to diversity in relation to social diversity. Nearly all of it was about IT programs and diversity in IT programs. So there's an issue about what is meant by certain words. I tend to use inclusivity inclusive curriculum, inclusive environments, rather than either of those. And decolonising the curriculum is part of that, diversifying the profile of delivery, and also to some extent diversifying the profile of students is part of that. But there's a sort of overarching umbrella aim in terms of achieving an inclusive, all-embracing curriculum, which covers intersectionality, different characteristics, different attributes, etc. And certainly in my discipline, architecture, again, as I said decades ago, the Society of Black Architects, of which I was a founder member, was promoting, teaching global architecture in schools of architecture decades ago, and that still isn't happening.
Thank you, Anne, for that. I think it's all right to say that they are somehow intertwined, diversifying and decolonizing the curriculum. But Xavier, there's a point you made in terms of relinquishing control, and you also talked about starting the conversation when students or when people are young, based on the comment that we had in the comment section. But my question is, how do we challenge something that has existed for such a long time? Like, it's basically embedded in the HE system, that it wasn't it wasn't built for people, like for everyone. So how do we challenge something that has existed for a really long time? I guess this question should go to Xavier, since you said we probably wouldn't see change until people in leadership position begin to relinquish control. How do we get to that point? And basically, how do we challenge this institutional issues that has been on for a long time?
I think it's a good question. I think for a long time there's plenty of research that points out the kind of benefits of diversity in a business context, and I think universities are often run like business, or almost always run like businesses, and until their pockets get hit, I think at that point is when things will start to shift. And I think it's a shame that we have to wait for profits to have this impact and not put people first. But I think it starts with people having a willingness to be bold, to stand out, to be different. I think the longer we wait, I think picking up on the Simon's comment and question, I think it was a good question. I think universities for a long time have led the way. I think in terms of, like Emmanuel mentioned, kind of flat earth theory, that it would have been equivalents or higher education equivalents that would have kind of attempted to dismantle that theory. It was universities that have been funded by slave money. It's universities that have pushed ideologies around eugenics. They play an important role. But I think it takes people who are willing to stand up and stand out and be different and not follow the status quo and lead. And it's about allyship, it's about leadership. So for example, we've seen there's an NUS and Universities UK report called Closing the Gap. And that states that the #1 priority in terms of closing the attainment gaps is strong leaders. It's people standing out, making cause changes to the way that universities view their key performance indicators. And it's about, some of this is happening slowly at UE, but things about staff for being questioned, or there's too much choice, there's too many places to hide. You don't have to be part of this conversation. And I think when we get to a point where it's dictated that everyone needs to be aware of this needs to be everyone's priority, then things start to change. But until then, I think we'll just carry on in this kind of blind, we'll just carry on walking and following the trends of other universities that we compete with, and not setting the way, like Kingston University or in Goldsmiths University that called out, that released a statement saying we have an institutional racism problem at this university. That's what I think it will take.
Why do you think that academics, or should I say people in HE, in terms of administrative roles, are sort of like scared? It's almost like no one is willing, or everyone is sort of scared to take that next bold step. Is it that we're scared of losing, like academics, or
people are scared
students
to
would.
people are scared to talk about race. I think it's a topic that scares a lot of people. I think
Mhm.
I can't necessarily empathize that because that's my experience as a Black person, but I can see that people are afraid to get things wrong. Being accused of being a racist in some cases is more serious than the racism that you inflict, that someone might be inflicting. I think a big problem that we see in HE is people who are tasked and paid and resourced to lead the way don't like having conversations about race and racism. And I say this a lot, Manuel and Anne would have been saying this countless times, but I don't see another aspect of university where if you don't have relevant expertise, you lead. In terms of research, in terms of HR, in terms of accommodation, if you don't know what you're talking about, you don't lead on that conversation. And we've got a big issue in terms of nationally, but I have to also state that it's an issue at UE in terms of BAME staff recruitment, in terms of BAME health retention, in terms of people progressing into leadership roles. We have about 1% of professors in the UK are Black. There's like 26 of those are women out of, we're talking like hundreds of thousands. It's crazy.
Mr.
It's
Emmanuel, do
40
you
now, but it's a
Oh, is it
woman.
40? Okay, I'm a little bit out of
I
date.
think,
Sorry.
well, I keep telling me a different thing. Somebody told me off for quoting the 26 one last time, and they said it was something like 40, but I might be wrong. But that's out of 21,000 professors. So that, you know, that's the scale of the problem that, you know, we're very rare.
Mm,
Put it that way.
Why is that so, though? Because I think it's a circle. Until I think it still goes back to the initial conversation until we start to decolonize our curriculum right from the start, let's say from crèche, and you see people like you in those spaces teaching you. But do you think because we have sort of grown up in a space where we don't see people like us doing those roles that we don't get to do them, or we're just having to not break that glass ceiling? Why do you think that is?
I don't think it's just about not seeing people doing those roles that reflect our image. I think it has an impact in terms of possibly aspiration, but I think a lot of us know very highly able people who should be in leadership positions that aren't, and it looks very much as though the colour of their skin is a factor in that decision making. And I think, as Xavier said, also there's a lack of expertise around race, and there's a lack of commitment around race in higher education in key parts of organisations. And so it's a kind of double whammy. But the data, you know, on representation in higher education, people of colour, is pretty shocking, frankly, where people are concentrated and where people are expected to be. You know, so, you know, I mean, I'll tell somebody else's story, but, you know, if somebody's mistaken for a cleaner when they're actually a lecturer, it doesn't particularly go down very well, does it? But that is telling you what role the expectation for somebody of your skin colour should occupy. And that, you know, it's another part of this colonial take that, yes, you are fit to be here, but only in particular roles. And there is, you know, one of the things, you know, I mean, I suppose one of the issues about discrimination in higher education is it's very rarely, I mean, that it's completely, you know, kind of verbal discrimination in the way that you'd necessarily say that one incident is that, but it's pernicious, and it's very damaging, you know, in terms of whether it's about assuming who has leadership potential, who has higher intelligence. It goes across the board in terms of it explains why things like people reaching professorships don't reach professorships, because of the way their research is assessed or accepted. It's about whether or not people get onto PhD programs. whether there's preferential treatment on that, and as I said about recruitment and retention. So it's kind of pernicious, as how it's been described before, that you have to examine the patterns rather than the sort of always the individual experiences.
Sorry?
Can I comment a bit on that as well?
Oh, yeah.
I think I was just thinking as Anne was speaking, as Xavier was speaking, when we talk of decolonization, I think there's something we need to go beyond. One of the things I've learned over time is how language and who owns language actually determines and controls the way the conversation actually goes. So we're using the word right now, decolonization. We have been using diversity, we've been using inclusivity. I think let's repackage that conversation. I'm a scientist. If someone has an infection, we treat an infection because we want to rid an infection. When people have worms, we want to deworm the person. A lot of what we're talking about is actually a racial structure, structures built on racism. But we are not prepared to actually do the work of deracializing ourselves, which is really what we're talking about. Because one of the things with racism, I think with having learned biology, one of the things you want to learn is the sort of origin of species, hierarchies of existence, and that's built on race. With that comes hierarchy of experience, hierarchy of truth, hierarchy of knowledge, hierarchy of acceptance, of ability, hierarchy of just anything that actually is put in front of us. So which means as a person of color who comes into a space, I have to break through all of those things. So my reality is not seen as the same as anybody else's reality. So my experience is a marginalized experience, which is when I'm sharing my experience, it doesn't hold the same level of impact as somebody else who might be from a majority within the space that we're in. The knowledge. So Anne has given an example of people being asked whether they're cleaners. That happened to me when I came to UWI. In my first week at the ECC, a student walks up to me to ask me why I'm standing at the lectern. So I was discussing with the CEO of one of the UK professional societies a couple of days ago in terms of why we need to do this work in education. So it's beyond the university conversation because universities are also operating under a different body. They also operate under government. How is that work actually going beyond the educational system to the funding bodies? Because actually you need to fund this type of work, because actually it's not just going to happen at universities. The question which Simon was asking earlier about should we start a primary school, and the wording you use about from cradle to the grave, I think is perfect. It's about decolonization of the mind. Everyone has to really decolonize their minds. And when I mean everyone, I mean everyone. People who are within the global south, as we've described it, and people in the global north. Because actually, if you learned biology when I started doing biology in high school, origin of species was one of the things we learned. Hierarchy of existence was still taught to us. So the people who actually believe that the way biology is defined, the people who are higher in the hierarchy than others. So that is a racialized viewpoint of biology that has been shared across the globe. So these are the types of things that we actually need to start walking back from, because we can't move to a point of talking of full decolonization or inclusion when actually there is a belief system that somebody is just not good because they're not white. That's something which we need to be able to dismantle that. Otherwise, we are just having a conversation and putting plaster or bandage on a massive wound. And I think that's really something that we need to really look at, and we need to be honest about as well.
Thank you so much, Mr. Emmanuel, for that. But I guess for people watching or people listening or people that would listen in the future to this recording, it is if they're in a position of power, like, why is this campaign really important? Like, why should they think from a lecturer's perspective, from a student perspective, why should they think twice to say, I need to totally decolonize my mind, my thinking? Like you said, Anna's phrase of it's from the cradle right up until the grave. Maybe I should hear from Sahala this time.
It needs to be, so I feel like a lot of conversations that are had around decolonizing curriculum and like diversifying and inclusion, they're very performative. People have these conversations to say that we're talking about it, but how many times are you going to talk about it before something is done? I feel like from the beginning of my time at uni till I finished, these conversations have happened, but I've never seen my lectures change. I've never seen the content that I was being taught change ever. So I feel like these conversations, are they being had with the correct people? Because I've been in meetings when I was a student rep, like an academic board meeting, these conversations were still happening with people that are at the top, but why are the conversations just doing something, and why aren't they changing? So I feel like we just need to stop talking and actually putting some action in. So enough of talking the talk, we need to walk the walk. And I think that is the next bit of the journey. Okay, everyone's clued up about it. Okay, but how are we actually going to implement things to create the change that we want to see within the curricula?
The University of Bristol has, before the start of the academic year 1920, went through every single module guide and reading list to look at both the kind of diversity of the authors, but also the background of authors in terms of their appropriateness for inclusion in the context of the particular course, and that was done by people who had expertise and knowledge around race equality and other equalities areas. So they're 2 years ahead of us at the moment in terms of looking at and scrutinising an important part of the delivery. It's not the only delivery, obviously, but you know, to some extent, you know, the wording that I've seen, some of the omissions that have been made aware of by students, but also, you know, some of the, you know, the source material is highly problematic and does need to be diversified. And at the moment, what we have in a lot of university settings, including UE, is material that that encourages people who want to make change to make that change, but there's very little to reach the people that would refuse or be highly resistant to change. The thing that Kingston did was to challenge the people that were resistant and made it clear that they had to change in the end. I mean, you know, so, you know, starting point, willingness to have a conversation, but unwillingness to have a conversation, then calling that out. But most higher education institutions aren't, even though they have zero tolerance statements, when push comes to shove, that actually it's untrue. Whether it's a lie is another matter, but it's certainly not true that there is zero tolerance. But it does need to be addressed, and you know, put a business case that, you know, the earnings of BAME students are far less than white students, even when they get the same degree. And given that we have a significant attainment gap, that gap exacerbates that salary grade, and also exacerbates the kind of jobs BAME students can go into. And particularly, you know, at UE, it's not unknown that we have, you know, last count, we have a 20.4 attainment gap between black and white students. That's the difference, you know, between a first class honours and a third class degree, or a fail, in fact. So, you know, are BAME students, black students, getting their money's worth? I don't think so.
And I'm just come in here. I mentioned about kind of profit, and Anne just used the word about business cases. I think people, as people, prospective students, start to think more about whether, you know, they get value for money out of university. Particularly BAME students in particular will start to wise up about attainment gaps, and it won't take long for them to start Googling University of Bristol attainment gap or UE attainment gap, and it won't take long for them to see that in the past it was as high as 31%, the difference between black and white students, and so now it's around 24%. That's not acceptable, and they can go elsewhere and see, and that's the difference that will start playing in those sort of decisions will start, or they will start attributing more weight in their decision-making process to attainment gaps. And so again, whose job is it to then respond to that? And for me, it's the leaders. We can't kind of hang about, and the longer it takes, I think the more the university loses out, and the more students lose out and when graduates lose out. It's a lose, 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 lose for a lot of people involved. The other thing I would add as well, you mentioned about performative statements. I've had Anne talk a lot about kind of the result of that is that people feel gaslit, and because they feel that, hold on, at a university level, you're saying that there's a zero tolerance for racism, there's endorsement of the Black Lives Matter movement and so on and so forth, but on the ground level it doesn't look like that. And then people start questioning, am I going crazy? Am I looking, is it can anyone else see this? Because I'm apparently being told that something is one case and actually it's a different way, and that leads to these issues around recruitment. It leads to issues around retention because people then leave. If that's the ultimate, that's the issue.
Can I come in on that as well? I think the question around how do we challenge something that are we still on that, or we moved on into a different aspect?
We've moved on to a different question. Our question now is how, for leaders who might be watching or would watch later on, why should they see the importance of this campaign?
Okay, I'll just see if I can just bring two things together. The question around how do we challenge something that has existed for hundreds of years? I was actually writing some things down, which is probably why I missed a bit of stuff. At some point in our histories, there were people who once believed women did not belong in a professional space. There were people who once believed that if you had twins, you should be banished from an environment. That if you actually just said anything, then you're probably a witch and you needed to be burnt on a stake. Now, we have moved on through civilization. So I think sometimes when people talk about something which has existed for hundreds of years, that's the reason why universities fund research. If universities are funding research for innovation, but we don't actually think this is something that we need to be introspective about to actually figure out how we probably got it wrong for a long period, then are we really that curious? And are we really that innovative? So I think we need to be honest about ourselves and ask ourselves that question. Now, the question about leaders, there needs to be ownership. I think Xavier and Sahala and Anne, I think you've been very clear in terms of the financial impact of it. I always say at some point across the UK and in the US, because the US also has a bit of a problem around this, but US is ahead of the UK when it comes to these types of conversations. When parents and communities realize that sending their children to university means that they are paying the same amount of money but getting a lesser or less valuable product, they will stop sending children to university. But I don't think people understand the financial impact that will mean for universities, because we're always looking at it from the perspective of home students. So when we look at our widening participation agendas, we think about home students, but we forget that these so-called home students have connections globally. So if I decide that my brother or my sibling or my son or whatever should not go to a UK university, the next time anybody I know from outside the UK tells me they want to send someone to the same university, my response will be no. Don't send them to the UK, send them to the US, send them to Australia, send them somewhere else but the UK. The financial impact on education will be significant. So I think it's important that people also think about it. Let's bring it down to granular levels. I don't think anybody will be happy if you went to a store, you sent your child to a store, to a grocery store to buy groceries, and they came back with half the groceries, but you gave them the full amount. When I think about myself as a child, I know what my mother would have done for me. It would have done to me if I went to a store, came back with half the products that she sent me to go buy on the list. But I'm telling her that actually I took that list to the store, but I only came back with half the stuff. She will march me back to the store to ask the manager of the store why I only got half the product. That is going to happen to UK universities in the near future. At some point, the parents and the communities will begin to ask these questions. The students will take the conversations home. Now that everybody's getting quite aware there's an attainment gap, and the attainment gap is starting from very early points through exclusions from the ages of 2 or 3. Kids are starting to be excluded from school from the age of 2. By the time a child gets to the age of 5, 6, they've been excluded sometimes from 3, 4, 5 schools. And that's because people are not really willing to engage with people from different backgrounds, different cultures. And then they come to university and then we say, well, but this is the curriculum. And if you don't want to learn this stuff, then you can't be here. Actually, why should I be there? Because who is paying the salary? We're not paying the students to be here. That's one thing we also need to think about. So I think there needs to be ownership. There needs to be leadership across all levels of the educational sector. we need to step away from that denial. The denial that there's a problem, I think it's clear that there's a problem, but we also now need to move to a point where action needs to happen. So at UE, obviously, I think this year there is an inclusivity, culture and practice toolkit. But the next question is, yes, there's a toolkit. Who is using the toolkit? Who is embedding the toolkit? Where is ownership and accountability for faculties, for departments, for programs, for modules, on lecturers? How is that being factored into who is coming into the academy? When we're recruiting new staff, are we expecting them to bring in a different mindset and a different culture to the space? Are we putting in front of them the culture that we are now saying we want to move to for 2030? When we're working with businesses and partners, as leaders in the spaces, are we saying, if you're coming to work with us, are you willing to recruit from a diverse community? If you're taking our students on placements, we will not actually work with you if our students experience discrimination, racism, or narratives that are actually perpetrating and promoting a colonial mindset. Are we taking that step as an institution? Because we have that kind of power as not just a university, but a major employer and a major provider of resource for the region. So these are the types of leadership positions that need to be taken for us to be able to move forward in the conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Emmanuel. I love the word when you said ownership. Like, we need to take ownership of whatever we're doing. Like you said, we've just launched the curriculum toolkit, but how many of our lecturers actually make use of it? Do our students hold them accountable? Does the university hold them accountable? Which brings me to my next question. Like, for staff and students who feel like there's nothing wrong with the curriculum, we don't need to decolonize, I don't see anything wrong, how do we sort of change that mindset, or how do we sort of, open their eyes to see that there's actually something wrong? Because I'm sure till today we still get staff and students who don't see anything wrong.
I think one of the things is that Mona Macduff said something at the Festival of Learning, talking about how Kingston worked on this, and the first thing was to have direct conversations about what are you going to do to change your curriculum, change your delivery, but the bottom line was that if people were completely willing to change and they were delivering an inappropriate curriculum, inappropriate course, she basically said they have to go. And there is level where a lot of people are persuadable, but there will be people who are not. I mean, there is quite explicit racism in higher education, and even if people kind of couch that with other words, that is what is going on, and it comes back to the comments about gaslighting, etc. And I think one of the things that also needs to change is that we need to be clear that a white filter narrative is not one that is always an accurate one, and that's not necessarily about people deliberately speaking untruths, but it's a distorted narrative, it's an inaccurate narrative, it's a narrative that fails to pick up the actual experiences, a narrative that fails to pick up what the data is telling us. The data is telling us there's a problem, even without any narrative, any story that's an individual personal story. But also, some of the stuff is so blatant that it's indefensible, let's put it that way.
Thank you. And just from a student perspective, Xavier or Sahala, would you like to tell us, there's a comment in the section which says, how do we encourage students to challenge us? How do you think, from a student, based on your experience at UE, how do you think that new students or future students at UE can actually challenge their academics to say, oh, I think there's something wrong with this curriculum, like you need to step up, you need to challenge it. So what would you say that students listening could do?
So challenging, I feel like it's easier said than done. So for example, during my final year, I challenged one of my lecturers and I asked them, hey, I had a look at the what we're going to be learning for the next year. And I was just wondering, are we going to learn about race? Are we going to touch on this? Are we going to touch on that? And the lecturer just completely shrugged me off. And then I went to an SRF, which was a student rep meeting, and I addressed it there, but don't feel like anything was done. Multiple times I went to the same lecturer and I just said, is there anything that we're going to cover? I had a look at this. Do you want to have a look at like this reading, for example? I feel like it would be cool if like we could all read it. But once again, like I was just shrugged off. So it's fair enough asking students like go speak to your lecturers and question them and challenge them. But if you're just going to be shrugged off, it's really it's not encouraging. It's very like I just didn't attend the lectures, and I missed out on, because that was my worst module. So from the lecturer saying to me, just shrugging me off, it had negative impacts on my grade, and it had negative impacts on just feeling like I was welcomed in the class. So yeah, it's quite difficult. Like, yes, go challenge your lecturers, but also don't.
Yeah, to pick up on what Sahad is saying, I think I might sound a bit like a broken record, but for me, there's two key things, and these tie in with decolonisation. One would be ownership, and that's the word that Emmanuel used. The university has to own the issue for us to be able to have an open and frank discussion about it. Until that point, it's going to be an us against them mentality. It's the people, oh, they're radical and they're doing something that's against status quo, when actually we just want equality. We want open access. That's what we want. The second thing is transparency, and I think so. For example, one of my issues, having worked on the toolkit, is it's not available to students yet, and I think that is a priority, because it needs to be a priority, because students need to see what staff are being told, and then be able to say, hold on. Then there's you open a dialogue, and the students can then say, well, I've read that you should be doing this in the classroom, and that addresses Sahala's issue. Why are you not doing that? Then there's a level of accountability. That would be the third word, accountability. So ownership, transparency, accountability are the key things to me.
I think also, I mean, the way that, you know, the students, Goldsmiths in particular, they got together as a group, you know, it's not, you know, students can put themselves seriously in a problematic position individually, calling out lecturers' content, and even when it's a very small group, they can find themselves disadvantaged, and we know of particular cases where that's happened. I think students need to form the networks to a part of their to challenge. You know, I think the strength can come from students challenging the overall delivery and challenging, perhaps forming groups to strengthen the case, and by doing it by that. And you know, I think there is a certain amount of strength in numbers, where, you know, as an individual, you know, it does put you in a problematic position, and you know, it's a brave student who does put head over the parapet, you know, because as Harla said, it had an impact on the response was negative, and there was a power imbalance that meant that actually change wasn't going to be made. The only change that happened was Sahara didn't attend those lectures, and that, you know, disadvantaged her in terms of her, you know, her outcomes.
Thank you. And just to be conscious of time, that we only have 5 more minutes, just to close off the panel discussion. My last question would be, how do we move away from this constant conversation? Like Sahala said, we've been talking for years and years. How do we, like, there's a lot of Xavier said, there needs to be ownership, accountability, and transparency. But how do we make sure that these are not just words, we're not just saying them, but we actually begin to turn these words into action? Mr. Emmanuel?
It's interesting. You came to me first for that one. I was literally just about to put some things on paper. So there are a number of things I think need to happen. For us to move away from talking to action, or to making sure these things are implemented, is that we need to recognize a lot of what we're dealing with is not unique to the university. People are within an environment working and studying doesn't actually mean they are owned and belong to an environment, which means we're dealing with a much more wider conversation. So how much are we doing to educate the community that we exist in about the barriers that we have in the system? How much are we telling the community, for example, the student union? What is the student union? I'm bringing it to you guys. What is the student union doing to actually educate the society and the community that we exist in, that we have these problems, and perhaps maybe the families, maybe the city councils, maybe all of these groups have a role to play in challenging the universities and the educational providers to change their practices, to diversify the spaces, to decolonize the curriculum. Because we can speak to the students, like Sahala's example, one student comes into the environment, doesn't feel represented, tries to raise the conversation, it gets knocked down, the student just decides, what's the point? But actually, if everyone is aware that we are all dealing with a problem, because we have a problem that we are all dealing with, because if you have an attainment gap and a curriculum that is not diverse and is promoting a certain level of power over other, it's not a university, not just a single thing about for the university. It's actually a problem that needs to be broken down within the society. So I think there needs to be more done to educate the wider community. We also need to begin to challenge the power structures within the space. So if it's the funding bodies, are we writing to the funding bodies? Are we challenging the funding bodies? I'll give you an example of something that happened very recently. So following the protests, the Black Lives Matter protest, one of the biggest microbiology societies in the world, the editors wrote an editorial, which they shared out. A few of us who are within the same field have written a response to that, actually identifying, rather than the talking bits, what are the things that really need to change? And we're saying those things need to change because these are the spaces those things actually belong in. And we know that that's going to be read by every member of that society who receives that documentation. So it's how do we challenge all these power structures? How do we educate people in the community? But how much information do our students have? So at Student Union, how can you enable a student who has reported a situation where they feel that maybe there's racism which is perpetrated in the teaching or within the classroom, or something needs to be decolonized? How can you guys as a student union, A, support the student, and B, challenge the university to do better for the student?
Good question, Mr. Emmanuel. I promise you, we are challenged in the university. Like you said, there needs to be a lot of ownership and relinquishing power from the leadership position here at UWI. I'm just conscious that we only have 2 minutes left. Well, I'd like to say thank you to Anne, to Sahala, to Mr. Emmanuel and Xavier for coming today and for sharing your knowledge. The recording would be live on YouTube, so you can go watch and gain some knowledge. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Bye. Thank you all. Have a lovely evening. Bye-bye.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Have a good weekend.
You too.